Welcome to everybody. Let me just say a few words for addressing this kickoff meeting. As you know, this is a network which is granted by the European Commission inside the Erasmus Plus and Jean Monnet networks. So this network has the main purpose is to have a comparative analysis of the crisis and their systemic aspect in both regions, Europe and Latin America, because not only we share a lot of values and identities, but also we face the same global systemic difficulties. And in particular, we suffer on both sides of a too low total productivity growth with too high unfair income distribution, of course, with significant difference between the two regions, but the roots of the difficulties are in a significant part are similar. For example, the too strong rent-seeking behavior that is plaguing our societies. So we have the conviction that we need a closer bi-regional dialogue and effective cooperation, not just diplomatic, but also in a lot of important areas like economics, macroeconomic dialogue, and so on, and also for conceiving a way to cooperate better in the global value chains in order to face together and to exploit our complementarities. So this network has already a first result with the book that we have free access with the link on the program. After 3 years of work, we published this book, and then we reached a prolongation by the European Commission, and we are now starting the second step, the second phase of this project. This time it will be coordinated by the PUC, so the Catholic University of Rio in Brazil. Andrea will say this later in this introduction session. And this is so the very first public event of this second phase of the project. So let me now introduce the colleague who are addressing you the welcome address. We have, of course, the European delegation in Brasília with Costanzo Fisogni, who is a foreign policy instrument officer for the regional team in Brasília. And then we'll have the dean of the PUC, Luiz Roberto Cunha, who is professor of economics and who in the past used to occupy several governmental positions in finance ministries. And after that, we'll have the director of the institute, where Andrea, the coordinator of this second phase of the project, is working with, Luiz Manuel Fernandes. It's a specialist in innovation and knowledge economy. He used to be Deputy Minister for Science and Technology, and he's also a geopolitical scientist. So, colleagues, you have the floor. First, Costanzo, please, in the name of the European Union.
Thank you very much, Professor Ghymers. Good morning, good afternoon, professors and students. I'm honored to participate to the Jean Monnet events today with so many distinguished lecturers and participants. First of all, I would like to salute the members of this opening panel, Professor Christian Ghymers of IRELAC and RTI, Professor Luiz Roberto Cunha, Dean of PUC, and Professor Luiz Manuel Fernandes, Director of Institute of International Relations, again of PUC-Rio. I would like to make a special reference and thanks to Professor Andrea Ribeiro Hoffman for the kind invitation to the EU delegation in Brazil, and for the constant and fruitful dialogue that she has with me, with the delegation, and with all the colleagues of the delegation. I bring you all the greetings of Ambassador Ibáñez, the ambassador of the European Union in Brazil, that is always supporting with passion all activities implemented by the Monnet Network in Brazil, as well as those made with international partners as this seminar. Let me also congratulate you for gathering so many prestigious research institutions, such as the Sussex University, IDS, RTI, IRELAC, University of Paris, Nanterre, the World Resources Institute, USP, the Centro Studi Federalismo, among others. And especially then to congratulate you for joining forces also with the European Parliament and other international organizations. I see in this event really the spirit of the Monnet initiative of creating bridges among academia and people, analyzing global trends, reflecting on the EU presence in the world, as well as discussing future options for intervention to tackle global challenges and common problems. Let me please make a brief reference to the continuous work done by Brazilian academia to join and enhance its presence in the Erasmus Plus and Monnet programs. From 2014 until today, 17 projects have been financed in Brazil. 6 chairs, 3 modules, 2 centers of excellence, 5 networks, 1 project, and there is more space for many more institutions in Brazil to access the program. Brazil is a country with a paramount presence in the program, a leader in the continent. I think that this demonstrates, in my opinion, the quality of the Brazilian academia and its capacity to network in the region, as well as with other EU academic institutions. And from what I've seen of the high level of panelists, professor, academia joining here today, it's clear that this dialogue developed by Brazil is very strong. And I really congratulate all the professors and all the academic institutions, in specific the PUC-Rio, for leading this event and this network. I must say that I'm especially honored to celebrate with you today also the European months. You know, the 9th of May have been celebrated a few days ago, and it is really an important date for us that we like to celebrate with the Monnet professor. Of course, the 9th of May recalls the Schuman Declaration that embeds some of the very essence and very important value of the European Union: peace, solidarity, and democracy. And celebrating with you from the Monnet Network is very significant for us, because we consider you to be ambassadors of the European project in Brazil, as we consider all the other professors ambassadors of the European project in all the countries in which you work. So today we are discussing this complex theme of crisis, equity, democracy for Europe and Latin America. To put this issue into context, I would like to remind you that the European Union is focused really on becoming a global player. And for that, the alliance with Latin America is essential, as mentioned in the April 2019 joint communication on EU-LAC relations. We are determined to strengthen our relationship not only with words, but with concrete actions. Let me please recall a recent speech of the High Representative Vice President Josep Borrell, highlighting our political, historical, and cultural affinities, and stressing the importance of strengthening ties with the region based on shared values and shared interests. With a focus on a joint agenda, we want to work with Latin America to accelerate the digital transformation and advance the green agenda, for example. We wish to deepen the relationship with our closest partners, including Brazil, that is a strategic partner of the European Union, with whom we cooperate on so many fronts. We work together in political cooperation, in the fight against terrorism, in the protection of biodiversity, in the defense of human rights, in commercial partnerships. So as Professor Ghymers mentioned at the beginning, there are many, many different issues on which we cooperate, and not always the traditional one that we think when we think about diplomatic relationships. It's important for us to join forces with the region and to tackle these challenges. And we consider also essential the participation of academia with ideas, proposal, and also critics, because this is also the role of academia to identify weaknesses and problems. And we thank very much academia, and especially the Monnet Network, when they contribute positively to this debate. So, by concluding this speech, I thank you very much for your attention and for the participation to this seminar, all the professors, the students, the researchers from Latin America, from Brazil, and from the European Union. I'm sure that we will have a very interesting debate. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, I think now it's my turn. Good morning and good afternoon to all the participants. And it's a great pleasure for us at the Catholic University of Rio to be part of this Monnet program. And it's more than a pleasure for me, as I have been a professor of Professor Andrea Hoffman. She's an economist and from our university. So it has been a very great pleasure to see this project being proposed, being accepted, and being also sponsored by our university. The theme that you are discussing today is very important also for us in Brazil. The crisis, the 2008 crisis, and now the COVID crisis has been affected us strongly. Brazil has, up to now, has not been as we've been talking in the beginning of before the section, problems that other Latin American countries has had on social unrest, and understand that because, the situation is very bad, but Brazil is at the moment, in a situation where the problems are so big and so great and so many difficulties we have that I think that at the moment people are more worried in getting rid of COVID, having vaccination and things that are very, very important for life. The economic situation is not good, as you know. And so I think this is very important that we have those discussions in academia, and very important that we can be part of this network that will have such important things. And I hope that the next meeting that we'll sponsor will be able to also have you all together here. And I hope for you to have a very good and profitable seminar. Thank you very much. And in the name of PUC, I congratulate all the members and thank you for all.
I think it's my turn now. Thank you. I'd like to greet and welcome all our friends, colleagues, and partners from the Monnet Network. Of course, for us here, it's good morning. I believe for you in Europe, it's good afternoon. And we would, it's an honor to be able to host this event at the International Relations Institute from PUC-Rio. I think myself and Dr. Luiz Roberto Cunha, we would prefer to be welcoming you physically here in Rio de Janeiro, not virtually. But the very fact that we have to hold this conference as a virtual conference highlights the importance of the research the network is developing. Because we are facing not only an economic global crisis, we are facing a combination of global crises, in plural, and in particular, short-term and limited, narrow views of how to deal with economic challenges in the world, global economic challenges in the world, can lead us to weaken public regulatory capacity and public investment capacity to deal with major crises, such as is the pandemic we are now facing in the world. Weak public authorities cannot offer the public policy solutions for a fast correction of the problems that have led us here to the present pandemics. And as we face major global challenges, we have to build global answers. So I think this is the importance of this conference. It's a conference which values a critical view of public policy options which have brought us here to the present global crisis we are facing, but it also highlights the importance of interregional and international cooperation to deal with these challenges. And in particular, it shows us the need to build, in terms of public policy, sustainable answers to the global crises we are facing, and sustainable not only in economic terms, but sustainable also in environmental terms, in social terms, in political terms. So I think it's very important that we are addressing these combined global crises, valuing sustainable economic development, valuing equity, social equity, valuing the consolidation of democracy, which is a very important concern, especially here in Brazil, because we have a still infant democracy which has to be consolidated, and the tensions that are created by the combination of these global crises can also represent a threat to democracy in our country. So I think this is a very important initiative. It's an honor for us at the International Relations Institute of PUC-Rio to be a part of this initiative. And I am sure that the discussions that are going to be held here will have a very important impact on public policy in Latin America, in Europe, and in each one of our countries. So I wish you all success in the conference.
Thank you, Luiz, Manuel. Now, may I ask to the previous co-coordinator, Bettina de Souza Guilherme, and Stephany Griffith-Jones, to present a very short synthesis of the phase 1 of the project. So this project was an initiative from Bettina, on that time working at the FUSP, the University of Sao Paulo, and with her, we co-coordinated this phase 1. So Bettina and Stephany, you have the floor, please.
Muito obrigada. Thank you very much. It's a very emotional moment for me, because it's like being the mother of the project and letting go of it, but knowing that it's in good hands with Andrea Rivera Hoffman, who takes over the coordination now. I want again to show the book that we are very proud of. It's the fruit of I think officially 3 years, but in fact like more like 5 or 6 years of research. A lot has already been said about the nature of our network, and indeed the nature is a cooperation, a bi-regional cooperation. So in fact, I work in the European Parliament in the Economic and Monetary Committee. I used to work in the Committee on Development. I was then called in the Special Committee on Crisis, where I worked with the rapporteur on the crisis for the European Parliament, Pervenche Perez. And now I'm very pleased to have Margarita Marquez, the rapporteur, on the reform of the fiscal framework in the EU, with whom I also work now closely together as a guest speaker, as a key speaker today. Benvinda. And and in fact, then I went for private reasons on a sabbatical to Brazil, which was not in crisis, but was booming in 2012, and was like the land of infinite opportunities. And one of the opportunities was to work for USP as a professor collaboradora. And I did actually work on our own research project that has to do with crisis and social movements. And at the same time, I taught together with my colleagues on EU, on crisis in Europe, and also crisis together in Latin America, the comparison. So this was like with Kai Lehmann, Maria Linz Tedesco, Maria Antonietta, and also Jose Briceño. And there came the idea, oh, we could actually make a project where we bring the best experts that I had met in the European Parliament with the experts that I was working also in Brazil, and later also joined PUC-Rio, Andrea and Carolina and Paula Sandrin. And the network then got not only this bi-regional characteristic, or not only this characteristic of being a network of academics, but also policy advisors with the participation of politicians and also central bankers, but also with social movements, and not only this, and NGOs. But along our project is focus on the social movements, which is like social mobilization, moved in the direction of populism, and of course also sovereignism and Euroscepticism. And there we got additional experts with Paula Sandrin and Carolina Salgado, and with also Eleonora Pole, who focused on the impact of the crisis that had then these new movements like Cinque Stelle or the AfD in Germany that became very powerful anti-European forces. So the network is also interdisciplinary, and we have in our book articles that analyze also psychological aspects of populism, and of course we have several chapters on like the populism in Europe, the populism in Latin America, and also integrated these aspects in some of the articles, like for example in the article on Brazil and Venezuela. But I want to come now on more into the main field of the book. The main focus is how was crisis managed? What were the economic, social, and democratic consequences? How the comparative approach, and what were the causes? And in our book, we have two chapters that basically introduce a more theoretical aspect. One by Stefan Schulmeister, who explores the effects of the paradigm change from Keynesianism to neoliberalism, and says in the breakup of the Bretton Woods system and the change from real capitalism to finance capitalism, the cause for most of the financial crisis, both in Latin America as well as in the European crisis. And Christian himself already talked about his focus, which was he discussed key systematic aspects of the global crisis, climate change, macro financial instability, and weakening of democracy. We then, Stephany will speak more on this comparison of the financial crisis between Europe and Latin America, but I want to analyze the second chapter, which is about crisis and regionalism, or regional, and in Europe we call it European integration. In Latin America it's called regionalism. And here we saw, for example, in the article that I wrote, or that Dimitris Katsikas wrote, very clearly that the impact of that paradigm change had a tremendous effect on the architecture, because the architecture of EMU was then going away from the Werner plan, which was more federalist and had actually foreseen a lot of the elements that were later missing when the crisis broke out. So in fact, the architects of EMU, which were mainly central bankers, had created a fully fledged monetary union, but had foreseen on the financial and economic side a loose intergovernmental cooperation with some control, but not foreseen, neither tools, nor rules, nor institutions. Yeah, so there was no crisis tools, there is no fiscal capacity, as there was foreseen in the Werner Plan, like a common budget. And here I'm already very much looking forward to Margarita's contribution about the situation of the current crisis in contrast to the last one. Their rules were mainly for those taken that were forbidding any kind of solidarity, like bailing out or common debts. And institutions were also the major problem, because the Economic and Monetary Union only foresaw, did not foresee any real kind of institution of decision taking, because it was not foreseen that some member states are not part of EMU, and so the informal Eurogroup became the major decision-taking body, and that without any parliamentary control or accountability. So this, additionally, since there hasn't been any of the tools, this led when Greece, in fact, announced that they had much higher deficits than initially admitted, that this crisis was like changed from a systemic crisis into a sovereign debt crisis. And the approach was then a very punitive one. And in the EU, the crisis management was one of conflicts and fights that were exposed and led to, in turn, led then to a very punitive assistance at the end, and at the same time a lot of antagonism that increased the populism and the anti-European forces in the European Union. We compared, we compared also then what happened with regional organization in Latin America, and of course there we have to say that there is no institution that is neither has the intention to be so strongly integrated. And we can conclude that the less strong or integrated institutions, the less they're able to actually make a meaningful contribution to crisis solution. And same in the European Union, where most of the crisis management was then done by the European Central Bank in the later part. But in the Latin American regional organization, in fact, with the impact of the regional organizations on crisis solution was minimal, and in fact, when the crisis broke out, it rather led to a weakening of this organization. We then have, I already mentioned the article on the increase of populism, and here it's interesting that, of course, this populism, the more this populism and anti-European forces got stronger, and in particular in key member states of the EU, the less it was possible to make any meaningful solidarity mechanism in the European Union. So, and even it went against European integration itself and brought the Economic and Monetary Union to the risk of falling apart. Yeah? What is very interesting, we then also compared how are the crises interrelated in the two regions. And there we saw that, in fact, for example, when the sovereign debt crisis in Europe broke out, there were financial outflows to safe havens, but also to Latin America, which actually strengthened then that region much more. So while Europe was like weakened, Latin America got much stronger. There was also this boom on also higher oil prices. And they could, particularly Brazil, could increase their influence and power, establishing the BRICS, having a stronger role in global governance, while the European Union, with its incapacity for crisis management, lost in importance on the global stage, and decreased its role, fell much behind, and also because it actually took over the same kind of model as in the debt crisis in Latin America was done with the adjustment programs, IMF programs, in a very similar style. And that was very questionable when you think that we were very proud of our social model and how this could happen. And this also led then in terms to decreased attractiveness of the European model and the European integration outside. When we look at these social movements and also populism, then we can see that on the other hand, like some European organizations were taking over the model over learning from Latin America. For example, Podemos and Syriza took over some of the strategies that were going on in Latin America before. At the same time, we can see the difference, like left-wing movements could not actually establish a leading influence in the European governance, while left-wing populist organizations could establish a lot of regional organizations in Latin America. Then I come to the last part of our book, which are recommendations, and here we go in. We had actually finished our book already before the crisis, the pandemic broke out, and we were actually going in a very similar direction, also suggesting a green transition, but also stronger than is the case here at the moment in the European Union. We also suggested social and green transitions, so an eco-social model that should be European, but also should be promoted on a global level. Fighting climate change, promoting green growth, suggesting new working time models and a renewing of the social welfare models. We also promote have ideas of promoting digitalization, high-speed trains, and the EU as a role, of course, also in Latin America in promoting the same kind of green progress and supporting investments. I mean, Stephany will speak about that. She has made a chapter on investment and development banks. And chapters also concerning European governance, about combining solidarity with responsibility. And one chapter that I had written where I pointed out all the proposals that had been done by the different EU institutions on how to change EU governance. And here this was including actually ideas of own resources, ideas of fiscal capacity, European bonds, European debts, as well as a stronger European budget. And these were proposals that the European Parliament had decided in the past, but since in the crisis management it was sidelined. It's very interesting to see the difference, how the crisis management has been undertaken this time. And I'm looking forward then that Margarita will talk about that. And now I give the word to Stephany to introduce the second part of the book.
Thank you, Bettina. Stephany, we listen to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity to present some of the results of our research. I'm delighted to be speaking at this important forum, and I want to focus really on the economic aspects of the crisis, and particularly macroeconomic aspects. There were, as Bettina already mentioned, significant political impacts, as well as social and environmental. I first want to talk a little bit about the commonalities of the crisis. And here I'm drawing on the work of Stefan in this project, but also work I've done in the past, also with José Antonio Ocampo. The commonality, one of the key commonalities of both crises in Latin America in the 80s and of Europe in the 2000s is that a very important cause was financial deregulation, both domestic and internationally. Liberalization of capital flows and domestic liberalization of finance. And that has led that financial markets, which are already inherently pro-cyclical, that is, they have boom-bust patterns, due to deregulation, have become much more so. And financial regulation that has been developed has not been sufficient to contain this. There also have been many similarities in the management of both crises. I think particularly on the emphasis of the adjustment and the austerity in the debtor economies, which then led, of course, in both regions, in Latin America in the 80s, leading to what was called the lost decade to development, and in Europe, in the Eurozone after the Eurozone debt crisis, also major falls in output, particularly in the crisis countries. So it led to falls of GDP, of investment, of employment, as well as increases in poverty in the debtor countries. So we had, and I think it's interesting, and the point is made in the book, that there is an interesting contrast, for example, how the US, although it often preaches austerity in developing countries, actually in its response to the 2008-9 crisis, where it had originated in the United States, but it had a much more Keynesian response than, for example, the European Union, and therefore it had a quicker and bigger recovery, which also led to a recovery of employment levels and a quicker reduction of unemployment. And I think in both cases, the Latin American debt crisis and the Eurozone debt crisis, there was really the support that went, the financial packages, which were actually quite important, tended to favor more the creditor banks than to support debtors in moderating the impact on their austerity and on economic decline. So this kind of perverse debt management, it is of course important to preserve this financial stability of banks and of the financial system, but it shouldn't be done at the expense of the debtor economies and of their people. In the Eurozone debt crisis, there was a more positive collective response at the EU level, such as the so-called EFSI, or better known Juncker Plan, which aimed at stimulating private investment via expansion of the role of the European Investment Bank, which is the largest multilateral development bank in the world. And this was done both through capital increases, which member states funded, paid in capital increase, which was very limited, but had a big impact, and support with additional resources from the European Commission. And this facilitated a strong counter-cyclical response from the European Investment Bank and catalyzing of important private flows. I would like to call it a sort of Keynesianism sans dire, Keynesianism on the quiet. We don't tell you, but we are playing a Keynesian role, not through fiscal policy, because fiscal policy was not allowed, neither at the country level, nor done very much at the European level, or done very insufficiently. But there was this expansion through lending, basically to finance private investment strongly, for example, for SMEs, which actually led to an increase of lending of 500 billion euros in the 2014-20 period. And I would like to make a contrast, actually, with the COVID crisis, which was, of course, not caused by the financial markets. They may have helped deepen it, but it was caused by this virus. And the contrast is that in the EU, there has been a very much more important role for fiscal expansion, both at the country level, where the Stabilization and Growth Pact was suspended already for 2 years, allowing countries to increase significantly public spending and investment, thus protecting jobs and companies, and including creating deficits. And furthermore, and I'm looking forward to Margarita talking about this, at the EU level, where there was the creation of a euro 750 billion fund, recovery fund, which was approved. It could be bigger, it could be better designed, it could be greener, but it was approved. And it was a major innovation because it, for example, implied that the European Commission is borrowing 750 billion euros on the markets. So there is common borrowing at a significant scale for the first time, and it leads to an expansion of fiscal spending at a European level, which will be used both for grants and loans. And the idea is to favor those countries that are have suffered more for the crisis and are poorer. So there's an element of solidarity in it. And there's been a continued expansionary role for the European Investment Bank and the national development banks, now with a strong slant towards green investment, consistent with this European Green Deal. Very positively, the European Investment Bank has committed itself to become a climate bank and lending 50% of its lending by 2025 to activities directly linked to the green transformation. So we have the fiscal response and if you like, the development bank response are working together as complements, complementing each other, reinforcing each other. Whereas in the previous crisis in Europe, the response via the development banks was a sort of substitute for this lack of fiscal response. But I think it's positive in the sense that Europe has learned its lesson. And to finish, I would like to say that in Latin America, there has been also now in the COVID crisis a fiscal response, but it is very constrained by the lack both of real and perceived fiscal space. Perceived because countries are reluctant to borrow more or to use their reserves, but also real fiscal space because it's very risky for countries to borrow too much because they risk then that the markets, who have up to now been quite supportive of most Latin American countries, may suddenly turn around, say when US interest rates go up and stop lending or reverse the flows. So Latin America needs really a lot of international support. And we have a positive, if we're looking at lights and shadows, the positive light is that now with the Biden administration, SDRs have been approved. We have some local institutional capacity in the region. For example, the CAF, the previous Andean Development Bank, now Latin American Development Bank, has important resources, but of course much more limited resources. And so Latin America, to restore growth, because Latin America had a very major decline in output last year as a result of COVID, the largest decline in developing country regions, unfortunately. So there is need for greater, if you like, support internationally. For example, by increasing the capital of the World Bank, of the Inter-American Development Bank, to allow greater lending, official lending, which is more long-term, and even some countries that are more insolvent, perhaps some countries in the Caribbean, we should require some debt relief, and the existing initiatives are actually insufficient. So I think it's important to stress here that although the response in the EU and in the US, particularly since the Biden administration, has been very Keynesian, has been very expansionary, and that has avoided a much worse collapse of the economies, which is good for those regions, but it's also good for the rest of the world. The response, as Jose Antonio has pointed out, has been much less ambitious and positive now in response to the COVID crisis than it was in the times of the 2008-9 crisis. So very good domestically, but not so good abroad. If I may, it's a bit out of subject, but I want to finish on an optimistic note on Chile. We've just had elections, completely democratic elections, and an assembly has been appointed, which seems to be very much in favor of creating a new constitution, which may give perhaps a new lease of life to the Chilean democratic process, and the political forces that oppose such a reform have been really quite soundly defeated. So I'm sorry to inject this Chilean angle, but but I did grow up in that country, and so I thought it would be an interesting note. Also, because economists have this bias towards being a little bit pessimistic, maybe I could finish on an optimistic note. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephany. Christian, I think I'm next then. So first of all, I'd like to thank you all. I mean, I must say some personal words also before. Thank Bettina, especially Bettina, Guilherme, and Christian, of course, as co-coordinators of the first phase. When I first met Bettina and we were discussing, I was freshly coming from Germany, where we were living for some years, and we were lively discussing the handling of the euro crisis, and I think we were both quite shocked with the developments and the way the democracy was already at that time being hurt, and we could probably never imagine that from those years to now, where we would come. At that time, Brazil, as she mentioned, was a country like looking forward and very confident of the democratic paths, and now we are probably one of our lowest level, and certainly for at least my generation already, who grew up after democratization, I think it's quite a shock as well. So from a shock in Europe, now I have a shock in Latin America and in Brazil, so it has been quite difficult to handle all of that, and of course the COVID crisis could only add another level of uncertainties and in a way, a necessity to face that and not to be paralyzed, because as we stop one crisis after the other, of course, and as it was mentioned, and the Brazilian society is paralyzed, not only because of COVID, but perhaps also because of all those shocks. And hopefully some other countries, we saw some, well, Ecuador, but we're also seeing now turmoil in Colombia, and now there is also in Chile, as Stephany was saying, some hopefully changes. So I hope that Brazilian society wakes up also in a certain point, but it's quite, of course, challenging given the COVID risks. And we are in a country where we have 2,000 deaths a day still, and very low delivery of vaccination. So it's very tricky. It's hard to not understand what's happening at that level. But I mean, as I just want to have a few words today. My own contribution to the network is more about the democracy and the role of regional organizations in promoting and defending democracy. So I'll be talking about my own research also a bit later in the next event. Of course, I also collaborated, especially with Maria Antonieta, who's here, about regional regulation of the financial crisis. I was actually very happy that with this network, I could go back to my original economist background. As Luiz Roberto was mentioned, I did my undergrad degree on economics, but then I moved to international relations and other aspects. So I'm very happy really to be able to have this chance to coordinate now the network with this extremely high level and also interesting people and with their research and with their human qualities in this network, because I think that the challenges only increased in a way. So it's I'm very happy that we could count with the Erasmus Plus from the Jean Monnet activities and the European Union to continue with this collaboration. And of course, we'll collaborate anyway, but it's always better if we have that support to make able a lot of our activities, of course. So what I want to say here very briefly is that we have a group of 8 institutions, and I just want to mention, in addition to IRELAC, USP from São Paulo, who was involved from the beginning, Stefan Schulmeister, the Instituto Faro Internacional, and now also the National and Kapataustrian University of Athens. Now Dimitris was already part of the network before. And we have 2 new partners as well, the Universidade Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, where our colleague José Briceño is now, and the Instituto Barcelona de Estudos Internacionais, with whom also I've been collaborating for a long time on these issues, especially the global social policy, which is also a new area that we want to tackle a bit more systematically, not even because before it was important, but also now with COVID, we are finding a new space in the project to include more on global health, also, and region at the regional level and the global level collaboration and responses. So I think this network has two very strong qualities. One is, as I mentioned, the high level of experts from many countries in Europe and Latin America, but also the interdisciplinarity. So we have economists, political science, sociologists, and lawyers. We do have people looking at those challenges from a lot of angles, what of course makes the dialogue sometimes more demanding, but also much more rich. So I think this is a very strong aspect of this network. I'm really happy that we are able to discuss macroeconomic issues with political scientists and populism with economists and from then on. So I really think that from the work we had already in the first phase, which was now briefly also mentioned by Bettina and Stephany from the book, we have a lot of lineup questions, and all researchers are working on specific issues. I won't list everything here. I want to invite you, we do have a new internet site now, which I can put in the chat later. We have there the information about all these researchers, but I just want to emphasize that we frontline also in this new phase, the question of climate change, the relevance to include the impact of climate change on the strategies of economic recovery and financing for development, which will be the focus also of tomorrow's discussions. This has been already present, but now it's one of the key aspects, together, of course, with the necessity to continue discussing populism and extreme right, as again, we know that even in this country, this has been putting a big challenge on our societies. So very briefly, we have also foreseen for the next couple of years events discussing these issues, and each of the events is co-organized with one of the partners. So I want to thank now also Christian and the other institutions collaborating with this organization of this first event. We'll be able to host the second event about climate change, also more directly in PUC-Rio. Hopefully presential, but if not, then we will, of course, profit from the chance that we do have webinars. I have to think that as well. And later on, we have events about global and regional social regulation organized by eBay, and then also Democracy in Crisis, Europe and Latin America, organized with UNA in Mexico. And then we discuss again finance governance with the National Cabaldestronian University in Athens. And we hope to have our last event, which will focus on the strengthening EU-Latin America cooperation in Santiago de Chile, co-hosted by the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, CEPAL, that we know lots of our speakers here had a long history of engagement, and which I personally also believe is still a very important institution in Latin America, especially given the fragility and the inconstancy of so many other regional organizations that we do, of course, hope that still have a role in the future, but I think CEPAL is certainly a key anchor in this continent to collaborate in the region and also with Europe. So I just want really to finish here. Again, invite you to see our homepage. We have there also a call for paper, inviting contributions also from outside, not only from our collaborators, initiative joined by our journal published in PUC-Rio, Contexto Internacional, and the journal Region Periphery from the National Cabaldestronian University of Athens. So I invite you all the audience here who want to collaborate with this discussion, that you can submit your proposals. So I finish here. I thank you all again, also the speakers who accepted to join us and are attentively listening to our own history. But also, I mean, we look very much forward to your talk now, and of course also in the next day tomorrow. So thank you very much. Again, I look forward to our simulated discussion, and I give the floor, I guess, now to MP Margarida Marques. Thank you very much for the honorable presence of you in our first conference.
Thank you, Andrea. Now we listen to our honorable member of the European Parliament for dealing with the fiscal framework of the EU recovery program. Please, Margarida Marques, you have the floor.
Muito obrigada a todos. Boa tarde. I move to English immediately, but as Portuguese, I start to speak Portuguese. Ladies and gentlemen, organizers, speakers, students, professors, researchers, It's a pleasure to be here on such rich discussion from the Erasmus Plus and the Monnet Network, and for the presentation of its book. The program of today is very comprehensive and touches very important issues such as climate change and on how this can change our international financial system. First of all, let me extend my thanks to Bettina for this invitation. And it's also a pleasure to share this panel with Stephany Griffith-Jones after our last discussion some months ago on how to deal with investment in Europe in the context of the EU fiscal framework. Let me start by quoting the founding fathers of the European project that gives the name to this network. Men only act in a state of necessity and usually only recognize necessity in a situation of crisis. When the 2019 European elections took place, the negotiations on the EU budget were already taking place for 1 year. The European Parliament demanded that a new vision for Europe as part of the European Commission program. The European Green Deal, more than a comprehensive long-term strategy for Europe, is the beginning of a shift of paradigm in Europe. Environmental sustainability at the core of the policy decision-making, but also with a social angle, people and well-being in the center. Following the European elections, the Commission put forward a new investment fund proposal at the beginning of 2020, the Just Transition Fund. The European Parliament had already called for the creation of this new instrument March 2018, and I quote, the establishment of a comprehensive fund in order to support a just transition. At the time, this proposal was ignored, and only in the period of a climate crisis, the Commission accepted the importance of such instrument in order to achieve a sustainable and inclusive transition. The role of the European Parliament has been increasing over the years in the European history. The financial crisis 10 years ago was a clear example of lack of democratic accountability in Europe. Last year, when the COVID-19 crisis emerged, we were at the middle of the EU budget negotiations. Before the pandemic, the Council and somehow the Commission were intransigent and calling the European Parliament's demands of a higher budget and more democratic and transparent instrument as a tantrum and desires that could never be fulfilled. In January 2020, the Parliament suspended all the sectorial negotiations until an agreement of the European Council would bring key new elements to the negotiation table. In March of last year, the economy all over the world has been freeze. There was such a high degree of uncertainty that policymakers saw big economies at the cliff if nothing was done. In Europe, there was a clear understanding that despite of the uncertainties, we can only move forward if we act together. To act together is also to include all the relevant political actors in the decision-making process. At the time that we are all brainstorming on what to do, for us at the European Parliament, one element was crystal clear. The solution has to be European and the European Parliament has to be involved. For that reason, when rumors came up of a possibility of an intergovernmental solution, the Parliament immediately said, no way. A solution was needed, but a plan B based on an intergovernmental approach would have been a defeat. A Parliament resolution stating key elements that were the basis of the recovery program. For the first time, and against many odds, the European Parliament was calling for European bonds and for the full involvement of its institution. The joint response to the COVID-19 pandemic has been remarkable. Of course, that more can be done. By responding forcefully and together to both economic and health challenges, we have created a very positive perception with citizens of the usefulness and strengths of the Union. Again, very different from 10 years ago. After many months of negotiations, by the end of 2020, the attitude towards the Parliament changed. The European Parliament achieved 16 billion more than the next 7 years, for the next 7 years, 15 billion for key EU programs and 1 billion for additional flexibility. When I arrived to the Parliament and I was nominated rapporteur, colleagues told me that I had an impossible task. Never in history, the European Parliament managed to increase the EU budget, agreed in the framework of the European Council. More than the amount, the most important for me was the signal that was given. The European Parliament was heard. And it could make changes to the political agreement at the European Council. Second, the European Parliament achieved to the creation of a recovery fund, the Next Generation EU, 750 billion anchored, and I underline anchored, in the EU budget and not in an intergovernmental approach, as I mentioned it in the beginning. European Commission will act in the framework of the 27, protecting member states with European bonds. Third, the European Parliament achieved a roadmap to repay recovered debt by fresh sources of revenues, so not to burden the regular taxpayer or by cutting EU programs. The EU budget includes, for the first time, a line on interest payments. It is a considerable new way of seeing the European Union budget in terms of source of financing. The joint EU borrowing will definitively support the international role of the euro, and it is a promising avenue toward the creation of a truly global safe asset. It is thanks to the European Parliament that this roadmap exists, showing to the financial markets the commitment and the credibility to repay its debt. Fourth, the European Parliament achieved to protect the EU budget from breaches of the rule of law. As I used to say, the elephant in the room. It was a red line to the European Parliament. European money has to respect European values. Citizens would never understand if that was not applied. Citizens, how is it possible that the Union was imposing macroeconomic conditionalities, but there was a leeway toward the respect of the European values? Fifth, the European Parliament achieved more democratic decision-making, scrutiny and transparency. Parliament to be better involved in the implementation of the Recovery Fund, but as important in the establishment of future crisis mechanisms and in the future MFF and unreserved negotiations. We cannot lose these innovations. We have here room of maneuver to rethink the sources of financing from the EU budget. It is high time to take this opportunity to tackle both the COVID-19 crisis and the inherited economic fragilities of the pre-COVID growth era. We have yet to fully grasp how the COVID-19 crisis will change our world. But even absent the current turmoil, the world has been changing significantly over the last 20 years. What we know is that the pace of transformation is likely to accelerate. In some respects, we risk facing this transformation unprepared. Many EU member states are forecast to exit this crisis with levels of public debt above 100% of GDP, with a high level of unemployment and loss of human capital. The risk of raising of inequalities is one of my main concerns. The summit in Porto was an emblematic moment that I have to highlight. We need to bring social aspects to future growth as well as the impact of this crisis in inequalities. We do, however, have the instruments to bring a positive and energizing agenda to the table. We must recognize that the monetary union is today better equipped than it was a decade ago. While recent initiatives must prominently the SURE and the NGU mechanisms were envisaged to be temporary, the underlying concepts in their design are remarkable and must remain within our toolkit in the future. If well implemented, it is an opportunity to boost support for fiscal coordination and risk sharing. We are facing today a dilemma. We need to have in place the recovery fund as quick as possible, but we need to ensure as well the good performance of the fund. If it performs well, it will drive the future of fiscal policy in the Union. We need to consolidate and leverage on this positive momentum. As part of this effort, I want to conclude by bringing to your attention the launch of the review of the EU economic governance. Now is the time to start an in-depth discussion on the future of our fiscal rules. The rules-based system that we have today shows severe deficiencies that are not up to task in the post-pandemic world. To apply the current EU fiscal framework would not only be unfeasible, but it would also risk jeopardizing all the efforts placed in the recovery. We need a framework that creates the right incentives for the pursuit of growth-enhancing policies. Rules have to be embedded in a credible, transparent, and democratic framework, coherent with the EU long-term policy priorities, always taking into account member states' specificities. And here the role of parliaments, European and national, will play an increasing role. Public investment is a central piece of this puzzle. Investment is dearly needed in our communities to deliver better and more efficient public services and to support a sustainable and inclusive transformation and to foster the resilience of our healthcare services. Public investment cannot continue to be indefinitely delayed. This brings me to need to redefine our new understanding on debt sustainability. We need to move toward a broader assessment of debt sustainability that integrates the notion of debt service costs, significant risks, and that allows for differentiate debt reduction paths. Crises are normally in the history of the European Union and must still be a moment of change. But change can go in both directions. It is our task to guide Europe towards a future that respects our values, bring prosperity, tackles inequalities, promote Green Deal, digital transition and cohesion, and puts again Europe as an example of a social market economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Margarida. Now we close this introduction session, and I am very grateful that we had this opportunity to listen directly to you in your rapporteur function, a very interesting flow of information. Now, due to the time, we cannot make a short break. May I ask directly to the following session to start immediately with the chair by Bernard Snoy, the president of Robert Triffin International Association. Please, Bernard, could you take your function of chair now, please?
Thank you very much, Christian. As chairman of Robert Triffin International, I'm delighted that once more we are associated to the work of this Jean Monnet project. We were present at the kickoff event in June 2017, and we are impressed by the quality of this report, and we are delighted to spread it also through our own network. Now, the topic of the second panel is climate change and international monetary system, challenges and proposals. And here again, from the point of view of Robert Triffin International, we are interested in this subject that brings together a number of unsustainabilities. As Robert Triffin International, of course, we promote the intellectual heritage of the late Belgian-American economist, Robert Triffin. And he was, as you know, the first in his famous dilemma to enunciate that the use of a national currency for global currency would in the long term be unsustainable. What perhaps he had not foreseen is that this is intimately linked to a number of other unsustainabilities, in particular a kind of unsustainability in the management of the environment, with also decreasing biodiversity and unsustainable use of non-renewable natural resources, and that this would be linked also to a financial unsustainability due to the very way in which financial markets operate, with the danger of that hyper development of the financial sphere and of speculation would in a way take away the abundant savings of the world and take that savings into a kind of a liquidity trap, making it extremely difficult to finance the huge investments that are required to prepare our ecological transition. And I'm also delighted to see in the panel 4 eminent economists, with which in one way or another also Robert Triffin International is in contact. First of all, Professor Michel Aglietta, who is very well known for his impressive work on the international monetary system. He's a polytechnician, he's Emeritus professor at the University of Paris Nanterre, and is scientific counselor at a very famous think tank, the CEPI, Centre d'études prospectives et d'infrastructures internationales, which is linked to the Prime Minister's office in France. Recently, he published a new book on the future of money, and on the website of CEPI, you can see also a recent video that he has posted on the systemic risk of finance in the face of the climate danger. Our second speaker will be Jose Antonio Ocampo, who delivered the Triffin lecture back in 2016, and who has written so much on the international monetary system, most recently this Resetting the International Monetary Non-System, published in 2017. Prior to his appointment as professor at Columbia, he was Undersecretary General for Economic and Social Affairs of the United Nations and Executive Secretary for the Economic Commission for Latin America and Caribbean. As we all know that he was in Colombia, Minister of Finance and Public Credit, Minister of Agriculture, and close participant of decision-making in the Central Bank of Colombia. And yourself, Christian, I don't need to introduce you, but we all know that you are the mainstay, the co-architect of this superb initiative. You have a long experience in the European Commission. You are vice chairman of Robert Triffin International, president of IRELAC, and you contributed, I think, one of the most important article in this report, this chapter 3 on the systemic nature of the global crisis and some principles for tackling it. I'm also very, very pleased to recognize the fourth speaker, which will be Magister Dr. Stefan Schulmeister, who in Vienna has been a very important economic researcher and university lecturer, specializing, among others, in the instability on financial markets and its impact on the real economy. And again, I like very much the contribution he made at the end of this report on financial instability, climate change, and the digital colonization of Europe. And I hope that he will present some of his unconventional proposals. Okay, I think that we are under time pressure, and I will immediately give the floor to Professor Aglietta, asking him to stay within 20 minutes. Oui. Professor, you have the floor.
Où est-ce que je le mets alors?
Il est là, non? C'est pas là, votre...
ouais.
Voilà, partagez.
On vous entend, professeur.
Partagez. Oui. 5. OK.
Voilà, et maintenant vous faites...
Maintenant?
Comme vous savez.
Yeah, okay.
That's it.
Okay, it's for me. Yes, you can hear me?
Yes.
I guess we have the time to do what was
20
planned.
Minutes. 20 minutes.
Okay, that's all right. So in the first part of the presentation, I will underline the nature of climate-related risk. I will suggest a price reform to guide the behavior of the private sector, and present a framework of financial intermediation for carbon mitigation, and assess the impact of the creation of central bank digital currencies. In the second part, I will claim that climate change as a global challenge impinges upon the international monetary system in requiring a multilateral coordination of central bank policies. I will argue for the advantage of the special drawing rights, common IMF reform to support environmental development policies. I will conclude with an inroad into tomorrow's world in suggesting the contribution of a digital SDR in a multilateral system. So let's move to slide 3. Ouais, il ne marche pas.
Next slide, Professor. We see only the first slide.
You click on the arrow, la flèche.
Yes, it is what
vers
I
le bas.
did. It doesn't work. Bizarre.
Sur ton clavier, tu passes sur la page suivante avec la petite flèche.
Non, mais évidemment, d'habitude, je le fais sans problème, mais elle ne passe pas. Excuse me, we couldn't see the slides. This is a problem. But it's not a big problem. This slide explains why the standard economic approach to control climate change is inadequate in asserting that markets can do the trick with the right carbon price. That is really a big problem for economists that are really under the idea only one price and the market can make a complete equilibrium, even if there is climate change. The reason is the following. The reason that it doesn't work is the following. Climate-related risks belong to intertwined processes that impair the biosphere and are known as geochemical physical cycles. They proceed from radical uncertainty, meaning that there is no historical precedent, therefore no rational basis for markets to price the risk involved. Hence, markets have no ability to insure the risk. The reason finally is the following. Resiliency, not efficiency, is what matters about climate-related risk, and the market are only concerned with efficiency. That's very important because the logic involved can develop divergent processes with tipping points. Tail risks matter, and tail risks matter a lot. A precautionary principle, a consequence of those tail risks, precautionary principle, under long-term strategic planning to avoid stepping out of planetary limits, should transform the financial system to achieve resiliency. That is what is really fundamental. In slide 4, we cannot see. This slide 4 introduces a fundamental price guidance for long-term low-carbon investment. I state the name of this price guidance. It is called the social value of mitigation action, or SVMA, social value of mitigation action. What is the rationale for it? The rationale is that COP21 has assigned the financial system a key role in aligning financial flows to make a priority of low carbon investment. The Stern-Stiglitz working group, to which I participated, hosted by the World Bank in 2017, has clarified the matter. There should be not one, but two prices to deal with carbon emissions. The first price is a malus. It is well known, the price of carbon in the form of a tax or an insurance permit to make high carbon commodities more expensive, to dissuade polluters. That's very banal. It should increase progressively, it is not banal, should increase progressively over time to avoid disruption in the structure of production. But for reasons explained in the preceding slide, it's far from sufficient. So the second price is a bonus, distinguish a malus and a bonus for different types of economic agents. The bonus for enterprises that undertake low carbon investment. The SVMA, social value of mitigation action, is a shadow price to align the financial returns of entrepreneurs upon the long-term social return of low-carbon investment, i.e. to internalize the externalities involved in mitigating greenhouse gases. Without this type of price, no entrepreneurs will make low-carbon investment because the financial return will be insufficient. So the SVMA should be set high enough to incentivize private investment in order for them to compute their return with this type of price to achieve carbon neutrality at mid-century. And of course, the carbon tax or permit should increase over time and converge on the SVMAs by 2050. So governments that set up the SVMA are also the ones that should say to investor, we keep our word about the increase of the carbon tax that will be equal to the SVMA by 2050. And so you can compute your return in using this SVMA. So we finally reduce the externalities and we internalize it. That is the most fundamental change that is necessary to really go with in the direction of low carbon investment for carbon neutrality. The slide 5, the following was a synthetic outline that depicts the whole framework of relationship between actors, the actors of a successful mitigation policy in each country. It is, we are still at the national level and we'll go after that at the international level. What is the type of outline that link finance, the state, and the savers and the firms and someone else? The governments must both define the SVMA. I defined just at the preceding time. The governments must define the SVMA to guide the mitigation of greenhouse gas emission, as I demonstrated, creating what we call carbon assets. So carbon assets is what? Carbon assets are the money values of mitigated greenhouse gases. If we can measure the quantity of greenhouse gas unabated, multiply by the SVMA, you have a kind of financial asset, a new financial asset called carbon assets. And those assets will be accepted by central bank as collateral in commercial bank refinancing. That's very important to internalize the role of the central bank. To avoid greenwashing now, an independent expertise will be crucial to determine how much a firm has abated carbon. That is very important. Those experts will deliver certificates of mitigation. So we need a new industry of expertise to get exactly what are the carbon abated in investment by firms. Those experts will deliver those certificates to the firms that have made the low carbon investment. And if you follow the reasoning, those certificates will be transmitted by the firm to the commercial bank that have made the loans for the firms that have abated the investment. And so the transmitting the certificate will cancel the part of the debt of the firm that has been directly related to mitigation. So the firm does not have to wait for cash flow. Transmitting this certificate will cancel its debt. That is very important to have an incentive to make low carbon investment. The commercial bank transmits the certificate to the central bank, and the central bank accepts them as collateral for refinancing. So we have all public and private agents that are together combining their efforts. The certificates are what? They are the counterparts of the so-called green loans. We have green loans with this type of relationship. They can also be securitized in another way, securitized into green bonds acquired by long-term responsible investors. Who are the long-term responsible investors? They are sovereign funds, they are pension funds, There are retirement insurance companies that can mobilize long-term savings. So we really have the full framework. A green bond market can get momentum with the central bank to regulate its market price in accordance with SVMIs. So that is really the central framework for carbon mitigation. But we can do better and more with innovation. That is a new paradigm is linking low carbon and digital economy. That is transforming payments in creating central bank digital currency. That is fundamental. Central bank can be as digital cash, that is tokens, or interest-bearing accounts at the central bank, like what the Bank of China, Public Bank of China is doing now for next year, Olympic Games. So CBDC, central bank digital currency, would make retail payment. What is the advantage of a central bank digital currency? First, making a retail payment settlement instantaneous. Would extend financial inclusion to non-bank people with smartphones, and would prevent the domination of private monopolies like Facebook in the payment system, like what Facebook wanted to do. With the replacement of physical cash by digital cash, it will improve substantially the interest channel of monetary policy because it will have the ability to set negative interest rates for counter-cyclical policy in recession. So in recession, we have a new, kind of a new instrument that is negative interest rates. Opposite, the banking channel could be weakened. Of course, the banking channel could be weakened depending on the ability of banks to attract bonds on capital markets that will be less substitutable to CBDCs. Deposit will be very substitutable to CBDC when CBDC will be developed. Commercial banks will progressively, I guess, become like more like mutual funds. That is, they will have necessarily to have capital in order to make credit or to buy bonds. CBDC is primarily for the domestic economy. So the foreign exchange channel bears upon the future of the international monetary system and what to do for internationally. There is a slide for that, slide 8, that asserts the advantage of special drawing rights as a fulcrum of the international monetary system. That is really fundamental for a very multilateral system. The SDR is a pure fiduciary currency. That is really a very big advantage. It is the debt of no country. It is an ultimate reserve asset that is no country debt. There are three main reasons to enhance the role of the SDR. First, to alleviate the exchange rate fluctuation between vehicle currencies in making transactions between central banks. The transaction will become off-market. They will become on the book of the SDR department of the IMF. That is, we will have less exchange rate fluctuations than we have now. Every time that people want to go to the dollar as the ultimate reserve currency, go out of their other currency to the dollar. That will not happen. This first advantage, first reason. The second reason is to reduce the incentive of emerging market central banks to pile up precautionary reserve as they do now. They pile up dollar much more than they need because it will be better to make productive investment in their countries. And the third reason is to enable countries that are overloaded with an excessive amount of dollar reserve to diversify them off exchange rate market through an IMF substitution account. So we have really very strong reason to have an ultimate reserve asset that is really multinational. To get those substantial benefits, the SDR must be acceptable as a superior international asset for central banks and for governments, and there are three conditions for that. The three conditions are the following. The allocation of SDR should be substantial in terms of stress, and they should be free from crippling conditionality. Second condition, the SDR should pay market interest rate, to improve liquidity. And the third condition, the basket composition should be enlarged to currencies of emerging market countries, as was done for the renminbi, that is now within the basket of the SDR. And so other currencies of emerging market countries can have the same advantage as much as they become freely usable. So they will have an incentive to develop very strong currency at home. The final slide, what can the IMF do to support environmental development policies internationally now? Because climate change is an international problem. All the questions that are related to different types of development policy are problems that are completely global. Biodiversity is global and so on. So we need really a global policy and becoming a policy of cooperation because we don't have a universal state. According to the Paris Agreement, advanced countries have committed to aid developing countries, finance low carbon investment, or that this commitment has not been fulfilled yet. Lending unused SDR to multinational development banks, which have the expertise to select and drive low carbon projects, will be a financial involvement to do it. So it is possible in lending SDRs to different kind of central banks that could lend to multinational development banks. So the link to multinational development banks is very important. It is possible to go beyond quota allocation with an emergency distribution of new SDR issuance. It has been estimated at $2 trillion to provide developing countries with the financing to purchase urgent goods against both the pandemic and the worsening of physical risk due to climate change. So moving further, it is possible to move further, but it needs an international monetary reform to make the SDR the baseline for institutional cooperation in a future multilateral monetary order. So digital SDR should become a flexibly supplied safe reserve asset, with the IMF becoming the international lender of last resort between central banks, shaping an institutionally cooperative international monetary system. So to finally remember, 80 years after Keynes' proposal to the post-war international monetary system, the building up of a truly multilateral system is back on the agenda. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Aglietta. You can imagine how enthusiastic I am about what you just said. Triffin was also a disciple of Keynes, and I'm pleased that 60 years after his book on the Triffin dilemma, 80 years after the Keynes proposal, here we are coming back to what should have been done almost 80 years ago. Very good. Now we move to Professor Ocampo on the topic of climate change policies to manage its macroeconomic and financial effects. Dear Professor, you have 15 minutes. Is it possible for you? We are listening to you.
I will try. Thank you, Bernard. Thank you for all the organizers, and particularly to Christian Ghymers, who had a lot of flexibility on my participation because I could not participate tomorrow. Let me say that I will, of course, try to concentrate on the topic of climate change or environmental sustainability and financial policy. But let me start by making perhaps a few comments on two issues following on the previous presentation by Michelle Egleta. The first one is that the main problem of SDRs today is that they are underutilized on a massive scale. According to my research, and I must say I am one of the very few persons who have actually done research on the SDRs, because there's a lot of talk, but there's no research on how the SDRs are being used. According to my analysis, about 85% of the SDRs remain underutilized in basically a bank accounts in the IMF because of the duality in the accounts of the IMF. So the first reform that has to be done is to eliminate the dual accounting of the IMF, so that and consider SDRs which are not used as deposits in the IMF, which then the IMF could use to lend to countries and eventually also to make deposits or buy bonds, let's say, of multilateral development banks, so as to make SDRs more useful. Aside from the emission of SDRs today, which is going to be approved, let's say, in a couple of months, I think there has to be the start of analysis of how to make them more useful. And my proposal is that the dual accounting should be eliminated, and the SDRs should be considered as deposits of countries in the IMF, which then the IMF could use. The allocation could also be redefined, particularly to take into account the fact that emerging and developing countries have a huge and very large demand for international reserves, because they are subject to boom-bust cycles of international finance. So they should, my proposal for several years, including in my Robert Triffin lecture, is that the demand for reserves should be one of the criteria for SDR allocations, aside from let's say the capital that countries have put individually in the IMF. Let me just in passing say that in the current discussions on the international monetary system and in general international financial cooperation, one of the major topics that is missing almost altogether is how to enhance the support for middle-income countries. There is a lot of discussion about low-income countries, but middle-income countries, where about 2/3 of the world's poor live, are totally ignored in most of the debate. So just in passing, I should mention that very important issue. Now, on the topic that that I promised to speak, let me start. Let me perhaps say I told Christian that I would be delighted to talk about this topic because when I was a member of the Central Bank Board of Colombia until a year and a half ago, I was the one who promoted the entrance of our central bank into this network of central banks and financial regulators that is coordinated by the Banque de France, but with support from the Bank of England and the Bank of Netherlands. Now, the analysis of what is the relation between macroeconomic policy, financial policy, and climate change is, of course, a major topic in the discussion. Let me say, again, in passing, that it's not only about climate change, it's about all the dimensions of sustainability, particularly the issue of biodiversity, because biodiversity is subject to even worse trends than climate change. I mean, we have, according to the analysis, already destroyed about 70% of the biodiversity of the Earth. So it's a really massive problem that has to come to the attention of the international community at the same scale as, fortunately, the issue of climate change has come with the Paris Agreement. Now, the major issue in relation to climate change or environmental sustainability, is that the economics is at the center of all these issues. And therefore that the environmental sustainability is above all economic challenge, a challenge for economics and for political and for economic policy. And this is, of course, a point that is quite important for the debate. Now, it's also important because aside from the economic dimensions, there are also equity dimensions. First, and above all, intergenerational equity. And let's remind that the Brundtland Commission defined environmental sustainability as an issue of intergenerational equity, how to meet the needs of the people today without compromising the future generations. So it's a intergenerational equity, and I'll come back to this in a few seconds, okay? Now, in relation to climate change, of course, there are although the crisis last year reduced the adverse trends, they're coming back very clearly. But above all, the commitments that countries have made are, as it was very clearly analyzed, are clearly insufficient to meet the Paris Agreement commitments, which is to maintain the warming of the Earth below 1.5 degrees centigrade, above the pre-industrial revolution, or at least at most 2 degrees centigrade. It is quite clear that the current trends, although of course the European commitments are a step forward. Also the Japanese, and of course the commitment of President Biden to rejoin the Paris Agreement, all those are positive trends. In any case, those commitments are insufficient. And according to all the analysis for several years now, the developing countries have to make commitments also to meet those targets. One positive issue, by the way, was last year's commitment of China to reach carbon neutrality by 2060, which was made in the General Assembly of the United Nations. But this is also a commitment that, by the way, Latin American countries have made, notably Brazil, which is, of course, according to the president, not making major commitments on the major issue in which Latin America contributes to climate change, which is deforestation, and particularly the deforestation of the Amazon, which is a major issue also for biological diversity. Now, among the reasons, let me perhaps say that there are three major economic challenges for economic policy associated to climate change. The first one is actually a conceptual issue. How do we take into account the welfare of the future generations in current investment decisions? The second one is that green growth is a process of a structural change, and how this is met by macroeconomic policy is a very important issue, particularly for countries like mine and several others, which heavily depend on the exports of oil and carbon, which are, of course, the major contributions. The use of those inputs are a major contribution to climate change. And the third is the issue of the management of the risk associated to climate change, the financial risk. So let me just focus briefly on these three issues. The first one is that the intergenerational equity is an issue in which the interest rate that is used to discount future flows, future benefits, and future costs of climate change has to be clearly taken into account. If we use market exchange rates, the costs for future generations are essentially minimized in current decisions. For example, if a damage of $100 from now is valued at about $50, if you use the interest rate of 1.4% that Nicholas Stern has proposed, but if we use market exchange rates, it will come out to $10 or less. So the less than 10%, let's say, of the future cost. For that reason, in my analysis, following Nicholas Stern, and actually a bit more radical than Nicholas Stern, my proposal is that the only discount rate that should be used is the rate of technological change, because that's the only advantage that future generations will have over current generations. And that means that something like 1 to maximum 1.5% per year should be the interest rate that used in discount analysis to analyze climate change decisions, investment decisions. The second point is that climate change and green growth in general requires a massive changes in the structures of the economies. I mean, the ones that have been mostly analyzed are the decisions on the generation and consumption of energy, and particularly the need to stop altogether generation based on carbon, and gradually eliminate that based on oil, and move into other forms of electricity generation and energy generation in general. But on top of that, also to improve the consumption of energy, the efficiency of the consumption of energy. All of those require investments. And I'll come back to this at the end about how to make or finance the investments, particularly in emerging and developing countries. But aside from that, there is also the macroeconomic effect in countries that depend heavily on oil and carbon as exports, actually, like my country, Colombia, but also Venezuela, Ecuador, and Latin America. And therefore, the major macroeconomic structural changes that have to take place in order to reduce our dependency on those exports, which is, of course, requires a major change in the economic structure of the economy, basically the export structure. Will have to change radically, and the international community should support also those structural changes for economy that heavily dependent, again, on oil and carbon exports for the economic activity. And of course, there is also the issue of technological change, which is required for all the forms of a structural change, and the intellectual property rights. Now that we are discussing, again, the issue of intellectual property rights for vaccines, we have to take into account also the intellectual property rights on innovations that are good for climate change mitigation and adaptation. And perhaps we should also, therefore, develop exceptions to those intellectual property rights, which are essential for the structural change that the economies require. Now, in terms of the strictly financial dimensions, we have, in a sense, two separate issues. The first issue is how we manage the financial risks associated to climate change mitigation, and the second is financing to investments to manage those activities. Now, in terms of the financial risk, it's already quite clear that the oil and coal producing firms are facing an increasing risk. And some financial enterprises are already trying to reduce the financing to them because of those risks. But this is also a broader problem because it also affects economic activity that are very intensive in the use of energy. Let's say, for example, the production of aluminum. and therefore the need to broaden the risk analysis associated to those sectors and firms that are highly intensive in terms of the risk. There are also what I call the transition risk, which are the risk associated to the policies that will have to be adopted in order to manage the transition to a greener economy. And let me say in particular, the issues associated, for example, to carbon taxes, to regulations that are going to be adopted, and the effect that they have on the investments. And not least, the issue of the risks, which are not linear and generate the possibility of catastrophes, for example, in certain regions because of the climate change problems. Therefore, there is a need, first of all, to regulate the risks and to force all private firms to include those risks in their balance sheet analysis, so as to be able to have a clarity at the national level of what to do to manage those risks, and to, of course, generate the incentives for those firms to contribute to climate change mitigation and adaptation. Okay. And finally, let me say that that international cooperation is quite important in terms of financing to climate change mitigation and adaptation of developing countries. This, of course, a point that reflects the principle that the main responsibility in the area of climate change mitigation is the responsibility of the developed countries, which are the ones who have contributed most to the emissions to carbon emissions and other emissions, and therefore that they have to take a major responsibility. And of course, the first point in this regard is that the commitment in the Copenhagen meeting on climate change of 2009, that they will have to increase their support to reach $100 billion a year by last year, actually, was not met. And therefore, that there is a major responsibility of developed countries in guaranteeing there are enough flows of financing for developing countries. And the second is, of course, a more positive trend, which is the fact that the multilateral development banks have been increasing their financing of climate change adaptation and mitigation, and I would say probably more on mitigation than adaptation, which is a major problem for several parts of the developing countries, particularly to the island countries and to the tropical countries, where the risk associated to climate change are stronger, and therefore they aside from mitigation, they do need major investments in adaptation. And let me say that as I have analyzed in a paper that I published last year, the trends are positive in the sense that there was an increase in financing from $11 billion in 2011 to $24 billion in 2019 by all the multilateral development banks, and all multilateral development banks have been active in this area. This is financing for emerging and developing countries. Adaptation, however, has been under financed, and therefore that has to be a major topic looking forward, again, for tropical countries and for island states, some of which actually would disappear with the problems of climate change. But let me stop here and thank you again for the invitation to be with you today. Let me perhaps add that I took the responsibility to guarantee that the Central Bank of Colombia will be a member of this network of central banks on climate change. But let me say that there are only two Latin American central banks, Mexico and Colombia, that are members. So all Latin American central banks will become members of that network. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor, for this pioneering role that you played, and thank you for drawing our attention to the size of the challenge, but at the same time, very positive developments towards taking it up. Concerning also the SDR, let me also remind all participants that Robert Triffin International published back in 2014, and Christian Ghymers was one of the members of the working group, a report on how to promote a wider use of the SDR and what were a number of concrete changes needed to promote greater official use and perhaps also a greater private use as a way to make it more understandable and democratic in a way. Well, now Christian, it will be your turn, and you yourself indicated that 10 minutes would be enough for you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We are indeed very late in the program, so I will be fast. So the main point is to capture the link between several market failures. So let me share, first of all, with this first slide, my personal reflection of half a century of thinking about the fact that humanity is in a straight way to disappear very soon. And this is due to the simultaneous failure of both technical aspects and both ideologies. Of course, the problem of, for example, the global warming or any other unsustainability is merely, for an economist, it's a technical problem, but the solution requires some change in the ethical aspect. So this is exactly what at the beginning of the 19th century, some economists already observed with the tragedy of the commons, of course, for a very local aspect, but all the essence of this moral hazard process that we are living now were already analyzed very rigorously. The same, Mr. Foote, Ernest Newton Foote, an American feminist in the mid-19th century, already demonstrated scientifically the global warming, but for being a woman, this was totally abandoned. So the technical aspects were identified very soon. And let me insist on the very interesting encyclical letter of Pope Francis in 2015 with Laudato Si, which is a remarkable global analysis of the systemic aspect. And he explained that our survival as humanity requires, in its own word, to turn back market into humanity by using market correction for restoring social value. For that, we need a solution with the two main aspects. We need materialistic incentives with the key relative price change in energy, in finance, in social cohesion, and so on. But for deciding this at the political aspect, we need a jump in the organization, not just multilateralism, but we need a longer term view, because present democracy have a too short view. For that, we need a total change in the gender imbalances, less machism in order to rebalance our society and to have a minimum of ethical change. What the concept of negentropy of Teilhard de Chardin, for example, brilliantly expressed a long time ago. So the major problem is the fact that we are postponing all the costs and moving them to the next generation. not just the public debt, but all the other debts, like environment or underdevelopment and so on. So we have a governance gap, and we need to react first technically, but only in a systemic way. A systemic way needs some ethical change. So look, for example, here, what we are doing presently, according to IMF, we are wasting more than we would need for decarbonizing the whole planet each year. More than $3 trillion are wasted. And these are figures from IMF last year. So what is this tragedy of commons? The diagnostic is the fact that unsustainable activity are systematically too profitable. So private yields are too high with respect to, or too divergent for social returns. The mechanism is just myopic relative prices or myopic subsidies, because this is not just due to free market, this is also due to subsidies, as I showed in the previous slide, with a lot of spillover. The solution is, of course, to make profitable, sustainable output. And we need to correct relative price, but we need also to tackle the financial, wide, unregulated globalized market. We need to manage global liquidity, that means issuing of safe asset, as a public good and not as a national good, as it is presently the case. Is it feasible? Yes, it is, but we need this governance progress, and we need to be broad enough for seeing all the link between these. So what are these links? Of course, starting from our point of view, from the Triffin dilemma, we see two big distortions, which are accelerating the global warming and which are also impeding decarbonization, impeding the Paris Agreement to take effect, because the dollar asymmetry buys net global savings toward US overconsumption. So it is not possible to finance, as we committed in Paris Agreement, with the present international monetary system based on a national currency. And the other aspect is the fact, and it is why essentially Triffin dilemma is still alive, is the fact that the dollar has a quasi-monopoly to access to a central bank, giving to the dollar a premium as the best safe asset, in spite of not being the most credible for a long-term view. But it is technically the safer for the operator in a short-term vision. So this creates a global liquidity instability and makes that financial yields are too high and are absorbing real resources, which is reducing total factor productivity in the world. So in fact, what we need is a global solution, not just to tax CO2. It is much broader. We need to impose a predictable raising path for carbon prices. And for that, our colleague and member of the network make the right proposal in one of the chapter of the book. And Stefan Schulmeister will speak about that after me. We need, of course, as Michel Aglietta already developed, but this is basically a proposal from Robert Triffin International, we need to create multilateral safe assets for regulating global liquidity for general interest and not just for the US business cycle. That implies also to regulate or to re-regulate financial globalization. Also on that, Stefan has some proposal, and there are a lot of debate because this is very technical and not simple. But for example, an auction system for impeding the damage of the automatic algorithm operation should be a concrete, effective proposal. And finally, we need to pay fairly this indispensable factor of production, which is social cohesion. For that, we need also multilateral cooperation for making fiscal policy broader, for example, for taxing some multinationals. So let's see here a very clear picture of the unsustainability from the global financial equilibrium. This picture is very clear that the US debt is really a time bomb. This is also clear that the US enjoy this quality of safe assets, which prolongs the Triffin dilemma because it has a premium for acceding to the only central bank which is acting as a lender of last resort. And look, for example, this nice correlation between the euphoric stock exchange and the world monetary base. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope to be on time, and I let you in your task.
Congratulations, you kept within your 10 minutes, but also you took us to the very center of those unsustainabilities, which are of an ethical nature, almost a philosophical nature, with also the tragedy of the commons. And now I'm delighted to give the floor to Stefan Schulmeister, because I think he will, in the same line, if I read correctly, his very interesting contribution, help how we can get out of the current unsustainabilities. Mr. Schulmeister, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very delighted to give a short presentation about just one aspect of the problem, namely which price signals are necessary to systematically reduce carbon emissions over the long run. So as the other speakers also already stressed, I will also look at the issue of the huge necessary investments necessary to fight global warming, but I will focus only on the aspect of prices. And I will now move to my presentation. I hope it works. So, yeah. So what is the necessary price incentive? It is necessary to anchor or to establish the expectation that the effective costs of carbon emissions will rise steadily and faster than overall inflation. Why? Because the profits of all investments in reducing carbon emission stem from the saved or the avoided fossil energy costs. Now, this is well known, and Christian has already pointed to the fundamental market failure of not internalizing social costs in a market economy. So the general recipe is, let's introduce carbon taxes or an emission trading system. And I will like to show you that both instruments cannot establish the expectation that the effective costs of carbon emission will steadily rise. Why? Because both fossil energy prices as well as the emission permit prices fluctuate much too strongly. To remind you to the simple fact that the effective costs of carbon emission consists of the world market price of fossil energy, so crude oil, coal, and natural gas on the one hand, and the additional costs due to carbon taxes or emission trading permit prices. And if the world market prices, say, for example, of fuel, fall stronger than taxes rise, then of course the effective cost of carbon emissions will fall. So these instruments cannot establish the expectation and therefore cannot establish planning security over the long run. The alternative would be that the European Union, as something like a forerunner, could set a rising price path of just 3 commodities, crude oil, coal, and natural gas, through a flexible fossil energy tax. And this tax would skim off the difference between the EU target price and the respective world market price. And the importance of the efficient price signals comes clear if one takes into consideration how tremendously big the investment programs will be as part of a transition towards a circular economy, because it calls for a complete energetic refurbishment of the entire stock of buildings by combining better isolation with photovoltaic heating pumps and batteries. It implies the construction of a trans-European high-speed railway net as an alternative to air transport. It implies the transition to emission-free cars and trucks. It implies the switch to hydrogen technologies, in particular in energy-intensive industry like cement, steel, etc. And for all that, we need to massively increase the energy production from renewable resources. And all these projects will only be sufficiently been undertaken if, of course, there is the expectation of a profit from these activities. And this is the more important, as the repayment periods of those investments are extremely long lasting, in many cases, several decades. And I switch now to the simple fact how strongly the underlying world market prices of fossil energy fluctuate in reality. And this is, of course, directly related, what was already mentioned by Alieta, but also by Christian, that we live in a state of finance capitalism, which implies that asset prices of all kinds, stock prices, but also crude oil prices, but also emission permit prices, move in a sequence of so-called bull markets and bear markets. Now let's have a look, just to remind you, at a little bit inverse relationships between the dollar exchange rate and the world market prices for crude oil. I cannot go into the causal relationships between both of them, but for example, there's some kind of struggle over world income distribution through both dollar exchange rate changes and changes in crude oil prices. If we look at crude oil prices on the basis of daily data, we see the typical movement of speculative prices moving in a sequence of so-called short-term trends or runs, accumulating to bull markets or bear markets. Here we see that recently, not only the price of crude oil, but also the prices of, emission permits in the European emission trading system. But these are tremendous strong fluctuations of these CO2 emission permit prices. This makes it impossible to calculate over the long run the profitability from avoiding carbon emissions. The most simple way to show this issue is if we look at one particular cause of carbon emissions, the prices of fuels. Why? Because fuels are already priced in the same way as a carbon tax, because the price on fuels, be it gasoline or diesel, is related to the quantity, and any quantity of gasoline or diesel translates into a certain quantity of carbon emission. For example, 1 liter of diesel relates to something like 2.7 kilogram of CO2. So we have already an implicit carbon tax as regards fuels, and this is extremely high. In Germany and generally in Europe, it's roughly between 180 and 200 euros per ton CO2. So much higher than the so far proposed carbon taxes. But here we see the world market price of crude oil in euros, and the blue line is on the right scale the price of diesel in Germany. And you see that already 3 times the price of diesel fell by roughly 30%. Under these conditions, it's not possible to establish the expectation that it will continuously pay off to invest in electric cars, to invest in hydrogen technologies, and so on. Now, I come already to the end. The proposal is very unconventional, but basically extremely simple. And here we have a thought experiment. What would have happened if the European Union had, in 2006, introduced a price path for crude oil? Meaning that within the jurisdiction of the European Union, the price of crude oil would rise every year by just 5%. This is shown in this price path. And the difference between the actual price in the world market and the target price would then be skimmed off by a flexible fossil energy tax. And if you would only tax 3 commodities, namely crude oil, coal, and natural gas, you could technically, much simpler than, for example, the emission trading system, create such a price path, which then makes investments in avoiding or reducing carbon emission calculable. So I come to my last. Oh, this, no, sorry. Doesn't work at the moment. Just want to push, I don't know. So let's do it like this. To my last slide. The basic idea is to make profits calculable from avoiding greenhouse gas emissions. It would promote investments in the refurbishment of buildings, but also in the production of energy from renewable resources. The price effect is very important because exactly the higher is the content of fossil energy, the more expensive would the goods would become. The price should be realized through a monthly adjusted quantity tax. In times of a digital economy, it is technically not a problem that the European Commission looks at the world market prices on, say, January or February 25. And for the following month, the carbon tax would be this and that. The tax receipt could easily exceed 500 billion euros a year. Why? Because the import bill of the European Union is very, very high. And the tax returns could then use either for promoting green investments or also for compensating low income groups. And of course, as long as other countries would not follow a similar path, which would, of course, ideal, the imports have to be burdened by a similar carbon adjustment tax, and the exports could be relieved from such a tax. So that was my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those innovative proposals showing the difficulty indeed of working on price incentives for CO2 reduction. And I think we should study very seriously your proposal of a rising price path for crude oil and other fossil energy, and the idea of a flexible fossil energy tax. Now, I'm a little bit in the hands of Christian because it is 5 o'clock. Do we have time for a discussion among the panelists or what?
Well, we are indeed very late, but let's propose the following. Maybe across our panelists, we have some question addressing to each other because we have not so many questions on the chat, but let's use a few minutes for listen to the other, and later tomorrow maybe we could be back to some other question. But so please, Bernard, address to the colleagues
yes,
if they have question and to specify to whom.
Yes, I think that perhaps we can ask first of all to Professor Aglietta how he feels about the proposals of Mr. Schulmeister and also the proposals of Professor Ocampo. Mr. Aglietta, do you have a reaction?
Michel.
Of course, I could say in the meantime that the slides, I hope that the slides that we missed of Professor Aglietta, as well as your own slides, Christian, and the slides of Mr. Schulmeister should be made available to everybody. So perhaps even tomorrow, yes, when everybody has had the time to meditate on the slides, there are some additional questions.
Of course, the slides will be available first on the website of the Jean Monnet Network, but also we could find a solution for tomorrow. I will see with Flavio Brugnoli from Torino what to do. Thanks for the initiative. But apparently Michel has not...
is not enough. Let's ask then to Professor Ocampo how he reacts to the last two panelists.
Yes, I guess my reaction to Michel, I made in my presentation at the beginning. But let me say that I totally agree with Stefan that that it has to be a rising path for oil prices, and that I guess that has to be guaranteed by taxation. So I totally agree with that, and I think that would be a major innovation. But beyond pricing, I think as we have all learned through years or decades, in terms of environmental regulation, in some cases you have to use regulation itself. So prohibit certain activities, period. For example, one thing that has to be done is actually to prohibit new plants generating energy based on carbon. I mean, that's one of the first decisions that has to be taken about coal, I mean, okay? Which of course a major challenge, not only for China, which is still planning to generate, to create new plants based on coal generation. That's one point. Now, on the issue, I was very impressed, of course, by the last slides of Christian's presentation, which are very interesting. I mean, one of the peculiarities is that both with the 2008-2009 crisis and with the COVID-19 crisis, many countries actually demanded more from the U.S. Treasury bonds. So it's a good transfer of resources toward the U.S. As the major global currency. Now, how you can change that is a very important issue, because at the end, it shows that the riskiness, let's say, of growing deficits of the major reserve issuing country that Robert Triffin pointed out do not seem to have played an important role during the last two crises. They may be in the future. That's a good question. Okay, but they have not so far. Now, the big issue, of course, is that whether the SDRs, so a big development of the SDRs could replace that. It's a good question because you will have to generate. I mean, one of the advantages of the U.S. dollar is do you have a deep domestic market for U.S. Treasury bonds, and if you don't develop a market like that for SDRs, and that will take lots of time, then the U.S. dollar will not be, it cannot be replaced in private transactions by SDRs. I mean, it's a big question of how you guarantee that so far. But anyway, that's my
Yes, the exorbitant privilege has been accentuated by the COVID crisis. The US have a huge indebtedness, and yet the dollar is still very strong, and long-term interest rates incredibly low. That's absolutely, that's another mispricing, as big perhaps as the mispricing of energy. But I let Christian answer.
With Bernard, with one advantage for developing countries, for emerging and developing countries, is that we can get international private financing, which is relatively cheap.
Yes, that's true. That's true.
The
Fed is your lender of last resort. But that's political also. Huh? There is a political price.
We don't get access to the Fed in terms of swap.
You have swap lines, yes.
But we don't. I mean, in Latin America, only Brazil and Mexico do.
Okay.
But we get lots of cheap private financing because private financing is determined by the U.S. Treasury.
Oh, yes, sure.
Yeah. Maybe I would like to answer to Jose Antonio on several aspects. The safe asset aspect of the Triffin dilemma is the most interesting aspect for understanding why the dollar is still the master. It not as Bob Triffin had formulated the dilemma, because the fact that he has a monopoly for access to the Fed and the liquidity of the T-bills, which are almost unique in the world, the question is not to imagine that the SDR could substitute for that. I am not against the dollar remaining in the day-to-day, the vehicle currency. What has to be done is to regulate the issuance of safe assets. And for that, as Michel also explained, there is now a solution which is at hand with the CBDCs, the central bank digital currency. Very soon would make an e-SDR very easy to do. So private SDR will impose itself, and the IMF would be obliged to change the status for merging the private one with the official one. And so the solution of the Triffin dilemma will be there. And it could be very soon, in a couple of days, if central bankers are able to harmonize their CBDC, markets will do the solution by themselves. Because with CBDC, we eradicate any kind of transaction costs. So making available the access to the Fed or to the ECB immediate for a Chinese, an Indian, Zimbabwe citizen could access to the central bank immediately without any intermediary. So global US bank will have to change their business plan. So this is a solution pushed by the market, which are very dynamic. And this is a quality and not only a defect. And they will need, with new regulation, they will need to find and to open new things. So for me, it's very important to develop, we have no time, but the CBDC are, for me, the way towards a fast solution. Okay, maybe you have other...
Let me put a questions to our friend Schulmeister. Yeah. To have this path for the price of energy, we need, of course, international agreement. Now, can Europe, do you think it's credible that the European Union could, in the not too distant future, take the lead? Because we will, it's like for tax competition, regulatory competition, or like for the tragedy of the commons, there is always a short-term benefit of being more laxist or to tax less and to neglect the commons. Let's hope we have a very, very strong leadership, or we have such a terrible catastrophe that suddenly we discover the need to stick together. Can the European Union really implement your ideas, Mr. Schulmeister?
Technically, it would be very simple.
Technically, it's easy.
It is, not so easy. We have still the problem of the carbon adjustment import tax. It's clear that to the extent that, let's say, steel imports from India or China include, of course, a certain amount of CO2 in their production, there needs to be the introduction of such an adjustment tax, but this is already decided by the European Commission in any case. And you have to relieve exports from those taxes, because the whole idea is the contrary of tax competition, because the European Union would in fact increase taxes in order to fight climate change. But as long as other countries are not willing to do so, of course, they have then to relieve their exports, not to lose competitiveness in world markets. So technically, it would be not so difficult. Politically and ideologically, it is extremely difficult, because my proposal implies that you take off the market its key function, namely price determination. So the price will not be determined by the market anymore, but this can also theoretically very easily be justified. And Christian already mentioned, of course, this fundamental externality. So the greatest market failure in the history of mankind is, of course, global warming, because the market cannot consider also of course, the future climate costs due to carbon emissions. And this justifies also on theoretical grounds the introduction of such a flexible tax. There would be many technical problems to solve as regards tax income, because of course in my proposal implies that there is no stable tax rate, because the tax rate is continuously adjusted to compensate for fluctuations in world market prices. And this, of course, confronts finance ministers with a new situation, because you cannot, if you have a fixed tax on gasoline or diesel, as it is the case now, you can easily more or less calculate what are your tax income. But of course, in my case, it's different. However, the gain from providing planning security for all those investments which are necessary to reduce carbon emissions will be certainly bigger than the disadvantage for finance ministers in calculating their tax incomes. You need then to introduce, for example, some buffers for the tax. So in case the world market prices goes up, there could be even a negative tax in order to strictly stay to the price path. But it is also clear that if such a big economic region like the European Union would introduce such a price path, the real consumption of crude oil and also coal and natural gas will be reduced. And this will also reduce world market prices over the long run. So there are certainly issues, but the biggest, how shall I say, barrier is in the heads of economists.
Yes, mental.
It's a mental nature. Yeah.
Very good.
Andrea wants to raise.
Yeah, I'd like just to make a comment and on two aspects that so we don't forget to think about it. I think Ocampo mentioned that with these plannings that to think about the macroeconomic effects on countries which are oil exporters, because in Latin America, as we know, this has also very serious geopolitical impacts, as we know with Venezuela, and Brazil is also an oil producer, and all these changes in these assets, relative asset prices probably will have huge impact on how also those countries relate to each other politically and geopolitically. And the other aspect that also mentioned by Ocampo is about the intellectual property rights, because I've been working with that in the area of health, of global health, which also in Brazil there's a certain tradition to reflect on the necessity of working with that aspect when dealing with social public policies. And I think, as understood, you are referring to that even in the area of innovation, in the transitions. So I think that's only two aspects for us to keep in mind, and the further discussions, and also broadly speaking, the work of the network. So thank you very much. I know we are all late, but I just want to use this moment also to thank all the speakers and all the co-organizers of the event. Probably
thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you again.
Christian, would you like to say a last word?
Well, I don't want to abuse our colleagues from the Centro Studi sul Federalismo who were so kind to provide this platform. So I'm afraid we are obliged to close here this important discussion, but I thanks again all the panelists, all the guest speakers, and I hope that they will have also opportunity to be back tomorrow. Not all of them, but those who are able, maybe we could tomorrow have a little bit more time for the question and answer. Thanks, Bernard, as the chair.
Thank you.
Thanks to the
colleagues.
Thank
you all. It was really such a
fascinating... warm thanks to Flavio Brugnoli.
Yes. Thank you very much, Flavio. Thank you very much, Valentina. Goodbye, and let us think
Thank you all.
The contributions of all of us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
See you tomorrow.
Bye-bye. It's a pleasure. See you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thanks, Flavio.
Arrivederci.